What's up? This your man, the STL stranger, Umar Lee. Could rectify no one live, but you know what it is. St. Louis Speaks podcast. You have to excuse the noise in the background. We live in a noisy world, a messy world. And one of the parts of the noise and the mess of this world is the operation of a motor vehicle. And these motor vehicles are taken upon these great man-made seas of the land known as highways, as freeways. They had a lot of intended consequences and a lot of unintended consequences. So after being back in St. Louis for the summer, I'm here in the great state of Texas, North Texas to be exact, Dallas-Fort Worth Metro, the fourth largest metro in the country, and in a period of 10 to 20 years, the third largest metro in the country, surpassing Chicago. And I know we have nostalgic, romantic urbanists, but in 21st century America, I think Dallas-Fort Worth is the new Chicago. I mean, Chicago very much had a lot of things going for it. Centrally located, the rail system, etc., in the traditional classical city. And Dallas-Fort Worth looks more like a 21st century American city, and it's sprawling. It's kind of in the center of the country, or in the center of the new population disbursement of the country. And I say Dallas-Fort Worth is the new Chicago. And very interesting things going on here with the big Senate race of Beto O'Rourke, Democratic congressman from El Paso, and Senator Rafael Ted Cruz, who we all know from the 2016 presidential election as Lying Ted. But what I want to talk about today is leaving St. Louis and displaced. And I want to start by saying I come from a family of people who don't leave St. Louis. We born in St. Louis, we die in St. Louis. Maybe you go into the military. Or maybe you get a job transfer, but then you come back. Or maybe something else happens in your life. But you always get back to St. Louis. And I guess, like a lot of people of my generation, which I call the hip-hop generation, and the square is called Generation X. Like a lot of people of my generation, I felt a little antsy in St. Louis. Born in '74, so coming of age in the late '80s, early '90s. We had the very toxic racial climate of North St. Louis County, where I was living. We had some particular family dynamics. We had some economic dynamics. Many different things that, for a young person, I didn't see St. Louis necessarily as an appealing place to be because of the racial situation, just because, I didn't really know that many people who were doing that well economically. And even those that I thought to be in prosperity, like they had, union jobs at GM and Ford, and, and once I went on later in my life, I learned that, those type of people really were not, the upper crust of economics. They were, pretty much closer to the bottom. I mean, they were, they had a house and they were eating well, but, there was not a lot of excitement going on. And so when I convert to Islam at age 17, I quickly heard from the Muslims. When I say the Muslims, I'm talking about the indigenous African American Muslims, not the immigrant Muslims, that the Muslim community in St. Louis was dead. And there was not really a lot going on. And that was definitely true. And so younger Muslims that were coming along who were serious about Islam wanted to move places with more prosperous and vibrant Muslim communities. And in terms of indigenous Muslims, that would have been at that time New York City. Not the case anymore due to gentrification, but at that time it was the borough of Brooklyn in particular, northern New Jersey, Atlanta, and then later on Philly would jump on the scene and dominate in a way that it does today in terms of indigenous Islam. So I go to Brooklyn not motivated by urbanism or nostalgia for cities, which, you know, as someone that loves history, I did appreciate the buildings and the neighborhood dynamics, but to me it was more about the people and the stories of families and people and immigration and different ethnic groups and different waves of populations. You know, the buildings were cool, but the story of families was cooler. But I was brought to Brooklyn because of the Muslim community, and this was at a time when hipsterism really wasn't a thing, and gentrification was kind of a thing, but it really hadn't really taken steam. It really had not gotten popular. So when I would be in Bed-Stuy in Brownsville, I'd be the only white person other than the police department or the fire department. And when I would go to other neighborhoods, they'd be predominantly immigrant neighborhoods. As I got to know, the Arab Muslim community, etc., down in the southern neighborhoods of Brooklyn and parts of Queens and the Bronx. So that eventually led me to the DMV, the DC Metro. But before I get into that, I'll just tell you a story about Brooklyn. So one day I was sitting on Fulton Street in Bed-Stuy, Fulton and Bedford. Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood, very famous neighborhood. It's kind of a hub for hipsters and gentrification now, but classically known as the neighborhood where Biggie grew up, the neighborhood where Jay-Z grew up, and in the Muslim community, the neighborhood where there's been a lot of history in the African American Muslim community, and really Bed-Stuy, like Harlem, were real cultural forces in the African American community in the 20th century. I mean, birth of hip hop and so many other things. So I'm sitting on Fulton Street one day at a halal eatery. And at that halal eatery, it was serving like halal bacon, halal sausage, beef, bacon and sausage and pancakes and scrambled eggs with American cheese. You know how I like it. I don't roll with the avocado toast. And that's another one of the great things about the East Coast is you had a lot of great halal food options. Even though I wasn't a strict, obviously a no pork guy, but I was not a strict halal guy necessarily all the time. But there was a lot of no pork options on the East Coast because of the Muslim community and the Jewish community. So I'm sitting there and there's like a debate going on at the table next to me. And people know me. They know if I hear a debate, I'm getting in on it. You know what I'm trying to say? Because Brother Umar like to argue. And so I jump in on it. We having an interesting conversation. And come to find out, I told dude, I said, yeah, I'm from St. Louis. And this guy was, at that time, one of the major hip-hop journalists in the country. Mahmoud Abdul Latif was one of the major hip-hop journalists in the country. And he was at the Halal Diner because it's next to the masjid. And he says, yeah, man, I'm from St. Louis too. I said, where'd you go to high school? He said, man, I went to Jennings. said, cool, man. I said, my ex-stepmother went to Jennings, and, I had a lot of road dogs went to Jennings, and you remember Cook, that shooting point guard. The whole St. Louis high school question. He's like, yeah, man, where'd you go? I went to McClure North. He said, McClure North, man. You used to have some ballers, man. Juan Chase and them, and, you had on the football field, John Vaughn and them, Dorian Brew. I was like, yeah. I mean, that's what the high school question is about. It's like, oh, yeah, I know people from McClure North. Oh, yeah, I know people from Jennings. Oh, man, y'all have some good teams. That's what the high school question is about, not about placing people, not about class, not about none of that type of stuff. And it's ironic that the people who say it's about class and placing people are usually the biggest snobs that you'll run into. So anyway, man, he's like, yo, man, let me show you around Brooklyn. And so here's this two St. Louis dudes, just trekking around Brooklyn. Magical borough, man. You know what I'm trying to say? And it's like, we saw it at St. Louis. We saw it at St. Louis. Like, yeah, man, this, we ain't got nothing like this in St. Louis. So, man, this reminds me of this in St. Louis. But we saw it as St. Louis. Okay. So I get down to, study, to go to the Mahed, and where the Islamic scholars were at the time. This is pre 9/11, before everybody started going to jail. I go to Northern Virginia. When you said D.C., I mean, there were Muslims in Maryland and D.C., but the action was in Northern Virginia. We used to call it Northern Virginia Stand. So many scholars, so many organizations, so many big players and activities and actions going on in Northern Virginia. So, and I get there because my man Ismail Royer grew up in West County, went to Parkway South. Ismail is living there. He initially went to American University there, and then he's working at CARE, and these national civil rights organizations in the Muslim community, and then he's writing, and then he did some other stuff that got him in trouble. That eventually, he went to jail on terrorism charges. That's another story. But St. Louis dude started out in West County, just a regular West County dude. Ends up fighting with the Mujahideen in Bosnia and going to Albania and whatever, Kashmir, etc. And so Ismail, the St. Louis dude, he take me around D.C. and we see D.C. like two St. Louis dudes. You feel me? You know what I'm saying? So, and in both cities, it's like, okay, being from St. Louis gives me a certain vantage point. Like, when I'm in New York City, okay, and there's certain things I can say, okay, this is totally different than St. Louis. Like, there's nothing about this that is like St. Louis. I mean, ain't no Times Square in St. Louis. There's not that level of urbanism in what I know St. Louis. There's not the level of immigration and diversity and the vibrancy and the people are forward thinking and modern thinking. And that's why there's so many Muslims, because people were open to alternatives. Whereas in like parts of the Midwest and South, you saw fewer people become Muslim because, people just in general are not into alternative ideas, alternative ways of thinking, I'm trying to say, whether they be secular or whether they be political. So we move on, you know what I'm saying, and let me get my sip of my QT cup. So like in New York City, when I'm in the hood in Brooklyn, yeah, this reminds me of St. Louis, because the game don't really change. Just the game is a lot faster and a lot more crowded. And my basic observation was that New York cats had a lot more hustle. They were a lot slicker because they had access to a lot more rackets, and they were on the water, and you had different organized crime factions there. There was a lot more going on, but the St. Louis cats were quicker to pull a pistol. St. Louis cats were more violent. When I get to the working class neighborhoods of Brooklyn and Queens, it does remind me of St. Louis. Yeah, it's more crowded. Yeah, it's more ethnic, but same struggle. Same struggle. But when you talk about Manhattan, which I interacted with Manhattan as little as possible, didn't remind me anything of St. Louis. So to me, it was like being on a totally different planet. Totally new level of wealth, of sophistication, of worldliness, etc. Trying to say, then you're moving on to the DMV, DC Metro, and obviously it's the capital of the United States, the capital of the most powerful nation on earth, possibly the most powerful nation in the history of earth. And so you got Embassy Road there, and you got so much dynamics. Like, even when I go to the mosque, like the mosque in St. Louis is just full of like regular people. Some of them got good jobs, some of them don't. But the DC Metro was home of the political Muslim immigrant, people that were political activists back home, usually with organizations tied to the Al-Ikhwan Muslimin, Muslim Brotherhood. And they immediately became political activists in America, in the Muslim community, immediately started setting up organizations and institutions. So the DC Metro community was just so much more organized, there was so much more going on, but that was by design. Even in that, I found out that a lot of these big shots with the Muslim Brotherhood in the DC Metro, quite a few of them had studied at Mizzou. And a lot of them had lived in Columbia before going to the DC Metro. I get there, and probably the most popular, the hottest Salafi, which is a hardline conservative Sunni Muslim lecturer, is there. Was a guy named Sheikh Ali Tamimi, where Ali Tamimi's brother Zayd had lived in St. Louis and taught a class in St. Louis, and I took his class. So St. Louis connections are coming up everywhere, but again, these cities are not like St. Louis. So living in Northern Virginia, I felt like a fish out of water because there were no blue-collar white people. And then when I got to the district, DC dynamics are just totally different. So always as a blue-collar guy from St. Louis, I felt like a fish out of water in the DMV because the white population there was basically middle to upper class to powerful and influential white transplants. Nothing remotely like I'd been exposed to before. So my time in the DMV, I was just completely cloistered and ghettoized in the Muslim community because I didn't see anything outside of that I could remotely relate to. Whereas in New York, I mean, there were other factors going on. Obviously, I'm a young guy and I like women, and so that would take me to different corners of the 5 boroughs, but also just the blue collar. I'm not talking about the modern gentrified neighborhoods, but the blue collar aesthetic and the blue collar culture of traditional New York outer borough neighborhoods is something I could really identify with. And the religious culture, whether it be in Muslim neighborhoods, Jewish, Catholic, etc., in New York City was something I could identify. But this secular white wealth of the DMV, whether it be in suburbia or whether it be urban, was something that, my life experience had not, led me to identify with, and I still can't really on any kind of real level. So I get broke, and I end up back in St. Louis. Every time I get broke, it's in the 90s, I end up back in St. Louis. I hustle up, I get back, I hustle up, I get back. A few different things are going on. Like my Sheikh Rahman Basir has classes he's teaching and is moving to, to Norman, Oklahoma, to Wichita, Kansas City. And so I spend a little bit of time in all those places. I get to Oklahoma, Wichita, it's the reverse. Whereas DC and New York faster than St. Louis, Wichita and Oklahoma City slower than St. Louis. And then I get to Kansas City, and the housing looks a lot different, and there are many different things that are different about Kansas City and St. Louis, but it's kind of an easy transition from somewhere from St. Louis. You're in the same state, and the culture is not all that much different than it is in St. Louis. So, that's that. A variety of things happen on the East Coast. I spent a few stints in the DMV. The dynamics changed from 9/11 because a lot of people started leaving the country. A lot of prosecutions came. A lot of legal suspicion. Just that tight-knit culture of brotherhood that kind of breaks down. Communities under a lot of pressure. Outside actors come and start spending a lot of money. Including those that call themselves allies, and it comes about shaping the narrative, and just shit gets kind of corny in the DMV, and that no longer becomes the hub for, I guess, political or scholarly and all these other kinds of segments of the Muslim community, and that kind of moves towards Texas, Dallas, and Houston, to a lesser extent, maybe Chicago. And because of the massive gentrification in New York City, this historic Muslim community that had been there for generations begins to quickly unravel, go into a state of decline, as many of those families start to move to metro Atlanta, to the Carolinas, to Pennsylvania. And so Philadelphia, and to a lesser extent northern New Jersey, become the new hubs as Brooklyn falls off due to gentrification. So when people talk about Brooklyn today is cool, that's how I talked about it in the 90s. To me, Brooklyn was cool in the 90s. And what I see now, like everything I love about Brooklyn is in decline now. And everything I don't like about Brooklyn is increasing now. So, yeah, I loved the Brooklyn in the 90s. I probably would have loved it of the 80s had I been around. Today, I mean, it's still a great borough, but not as great as it once was, or not as interesting as it once was, in my opinion. If what interests you in city is people and not buildings. And, young, wealthy white kids living 4 or 5, 6 to an apartment, fueling businesses, selling expensive ramen noodles and stuff, is not something I find all that interesting. I find it about as interesting as Chesterfield or Lake St. Louis, because it's the same population group. So moving on, every time I got to come back to St. Louis, I don't want to be in St. Louis. I hate being in St. Louis because everything I was into vis-a-vis the Muslim community was slow in St. Louis, and it still is. It's not as bad as it was. There's been some growth and development, but it's still like pretty much a backwater in terms of the national Muslim community. So after 9/11, I kind of fall back. I take a lower profile in the Muslim community, not as active. And I move back to New York City. And this time I'm in New York, I'm not really messing with the Muslim community too tough. I still go to Juma, I'm still around a little bit, but not too tight. I'm doing other stuff. I'm trying to, to be a boxing journalist and to cover combat sports and to be an essayist on social issues. So my essays on politics and social and cultural issues, no one's reading. So I'm just like posting them to random websites and blogs because no one really cares about what I'm writing. No one really cares about what I'm thinking. It's just wherever I can post and hopefully get anybody to read, I'm doing it. I start handwriting articles and going into college libraries and using their computers to write articles that I can submit to various publications, but all rejection letters. No one is taking my letters. No one is wanting to read what I have to write. And when I look back, a lot of stuff wasn't good. A lot of it was terrible, in fact. So I'm glad they weren't. Keep in mind, I went to McLuhan, but I was kicked out for punching the principal, and I'd been a stellar wrestler. I was a slim, fit, young wrestler, and then ended up going to Job Corps and getting my GED. But my writing skills were not good. Ismail Royer really pointed out. Ismail was like, yo, your writing sucks. So my first education in writing was reading Ismail's writing and trying to emulate him in a sense. And then I started reading a lot of library. I was always a reader, but I started reading better stuff, better books and magazines. And that's really, just reading those has been my education. Like, I still don't know any grammar rules. I still don't know grammar. I've just, read people, Saul Bellows, the Philip Ross, the George Pelicanos, the Richard Prices, and then reading, top-notch journalism, long-form journalism. That's really what's taught me how to write. So I get to, but my boxing writing was good, because to really be a boxing writer in North America, you got to be kind of in one of three places. New York City, so you can cover the East Coast boxing scene and the fights that are going on in New York and the press conferences in New York. Because even if a fight is not in New York, they usually have a press conference there. Number two, LA. LA's got a huge boxing scene. And three, Las Vegas, where a lot of fighters train and live and a lot of the big fights are at. So, covering boxing, I was able to write for a lot of major boxing websites like FightNews.com, BoxingScene.com, and many others, and get to meet, basically who's who in terms of famous boxers, from Roy Jones Jr. to Floyd Mayweather, Oscar De La Hoya, to having lunch with the Klitschko brothers, whoever. I met almost all the famous boxers at the time. Having their numbers on my phone. I used to talk to Winky Wright on the phone all the time, who was a middleweight champion boxer at the time, junior middleweight before that. So I'm kind of doing my thing, but it's really not. It's really apart from the Muslim thing in New York. But it wasn't paying no bills. So at first I was flat broke. And I'm in New York. I don't have a place to stay. So I'm like sleeping on the subway, shit like that. Then I find a little storefront mosque, which is kind of like an area of Park Slope in Brooklyn that like runs into like Gowanus and Red Hook on 3rd Avenue, where the Hostro is. For you squares that don't know where the Hostro is, that's for prostitutes, which y'all call sex workers. We call hookers. Just walk up and down the street at night, selling sex. There's a little storefront mosque there, which is mostly Yemenis and Moroccans. And there were several brothers staying there, because back in the day, it wasn't uncommon for, if you didn't have a place to stay, just stay at the mosque. And so we stayed there. We didn't have no hot water, no heat. We had a space heater, and there's several brothers, we would sleep surrounding the space heater at night. It'd be cold as fuck. Get up, put that cold water on your body. But I had a Metro card, so I could take the subway. And I had like $1 breakfast. I'd eat a 50-cent butter bagel, 50-cent soda, and a 25-cent Little Debbie. So it was like $1.25 breakfast. And if I had the money, I spent another 75 cents, 50 cents to get the Daily News, and I think 25 cents to get the New York Post. So I could read that on the train. Plus, I'd read other papers on the train, the Irish Voice, Newsday, whatever people would leave on the train, I would read, Jewish newspapers, Jewish press, etc. Amsterdam News, all the different weeklies in New York City. But I was broke. And then I met a young Puerto Rican woman who was born in Puerto Rico and grew up in New York City. She was living half the time with her grandmother in the Albany projects in Crown Heights, And with her grandmother, she actually watched the Crown Heights riot. She actually watched the man, the Jewish Chabad Orthodox Jewish man, be murdered. Her and her grandmother were eyeball witnesses. And she lived the other half of the time in Brownsville with her parents in the Brownsville projects, which I ended up living in on Osborne, which is basically on Blake between Rockaway and Mother Gaston, in the heart of the hood. Probably the worst neighborhood in all the 5 boroughs of New York City. Worse than any. That little area probably is worse than any area in St. Louis. Definitely at that time. So, but I ain't never had no problem. So we started kind of dating, but we was both broke. So we used to just like go to fast food restaurants and have free refills. We would take the train into Manhattan because in Brooklyn there wasn't no free refills because people would be loitering. We would take the train into Manhattan to go like downtown near Wall Street just so we could drink free refills and shit. Then either one of us hustled up a little money. We'll go to the movies. And we'll take our Metro card and just go to different movie theaters throughout New York City. And she learned that I like the nerdy movies. So I'd go off of Angelica. Off of Houston Street to the Angelica and to the various, dozen or so indie movie theaters in Lower Manhattan on 2nd and 12th and 5th and University, all up and down Houston Street, etc. Went to all of them. And she liked more of the commercial stuff, so we'd go to Times Square, the Empire Theater, even Green Acres out on Long Island, you know what I'm saying? But I was still broke. And matter of fact, sometimes, and so I didn't have no cell phone, so I would talk to her at the payphone. I'd walk over to Park Slope on 5th Avenue in front of Dwayne Reed and just stand and talk to her on the payphone all night. You know what I'm saying? And if I ain't had nothing to eat, I'll take the bus or take the train over to the projects. And, she'll fix me a plate from her grandmother's house, usually in Crown Heights. So, I'm still representing St. Louis, representing the Cardinals, but I'm deep into a New York thing now. But I'm like, damn, I'm broke. So, I got to find a job. And so a brother down in Northern Virginia had a job for me. And every time a brother have a job for me in Northern Virginia, it'd be an experience. Like 2001, a brother had a job for me in New York. In Northern Virginia. And then I went to the job as an Iranian brother. He was like, yeah, but you got to go to Arizona or to the Miami area, Palm Beach County, to work for us. I went to Palm Beach County. You know what I'm saying? And I ended up becoming very serious with this woman from Morocco named Sophia down there who worked with me. And like 2 weeks later, bam, 9/11 happens. And so like the business kind of tanks, but it was my messed up luck that in the apartment they had rented for me was the same apartment complex, Delray Racket Club, that some of the 9/11 hijackers had lived and spent time in. And it's double bad luck because when I was passing through Norman, Oklahoma, a year or two earlier, I had met Zacharias Moussaoui, who was the alleged 20th hijacker, currently serving life in prison in America, I believe. So it's double bad luck that I would have two kind of connections with the 9/11 hijackers. Anyway, so I end up back in Northern Virginia working this job, and so Maria came down from New York with me. You know what I'm trying to say? And my friend, we subleased his apartment. He was African American brother, but he was in Kenya getting married a Kenyan sister, and like they were having a long honeymoon down there. So it's, things are getting hot there around this time. Ismail Roya, my friend from St. Louis, becomes under legal problems, and and ends up getting sentenced to 20 years in prison. And so I really was like, yo, let me get out of the East Coast because this is just too hot for Muslims. And even though Maria is not a Muslim, she understands what's going on. And so we ended up back in St. Louis. And I didn't want to come to St. Louis. And she hated St. Louis. She hated St. Louis style pizza. She hated Provel. You know what I'm saying? She didn't know how to drive. She didn't have a driver's license. But we had some good times in St. Louis. I got to show her my hometown, and really showing her my hometown was like falling in love with it all over again. I was like a tour guide, just trying to sell her on St. Louis, sell her all the beautiful things in St. Louis. And it went down like that. But eventually she was homesick. She wanted to move back to New York. So we moved back, living in Brownsville. And eventually got our own apartment in Queens, in the Maspeth neighborhood. And that was the best apartment I ever had in New York City. My block, mostly immigrants from Ireland. On one side of me, a Polish bakery, the other side of an Italian bakery. Open the windows. The smells of the bakery would come in my apartment. And Maspeth, Queens does not have a subway. So without a subway, you don't get gentrification, you don't get hipsters. So it's like an island of old New York, of old blue-collar New York. That is not, and it'll probably change eventually if it hasn't already, because I haven't been there in a minute. But I really loved Maspeth, Queens, and Maria really loved Maspeth, Queens. So I'm there. By that time, I had started blogging, and I was making a big national reputation. So anywhere in the English-speaking Muslim world, United States, Canada, UK, Australia, I had become pretty well known as a Muslim blogger and was writing about a lot of issues, along with my friend Tarek Nelson, that no one else had publicly discussed. I was bringing private conversations public, and no one else had talked about racial issues in the community, gender issues in the community, like I talked about. And even the people that hated me, it's like, man, this is something new. This guy, he's got something to say. And that's why I quickly became the number one, as far as hits is concerned, I was the number one read for a few years. And it's been acknowledged by major Muslim media outlets like Muslim Matters, said they began because of me. So now I got people reading me. And then being back in New York, I got access to more stories and more stuff. But I'm still struggling, I'm working as a taxi driver. I couldn't get my TLC license because I had a felony. You know what I'm saying? So I had to, drive a bootleg cab in Brooklyn and Queens and work like in a hat factory and work for the SEIU on the telephone. And that was in Times Square, which is kind of cool, but they ain't pay shit, you know what I'm saying? And so, and then Maria ended up getting a job as a bank teller in Chelsea, in Manhattan. And then, it's like that. But we end up kind of, splitting. And I get back to St. Louis. And back as a taxi driver at the Clee Cab. But I'm bored. I didn't really want to be in St. Louis. I wanted to be somewhere else. So, opportunity comes for me to go to D.C. again to work as an aide to Imam Mahdi Bray for the Muslim American Society Freedom Foundation, and I'm back in Northern Virginia staying. And I was having a great time. I was having the time of my life. Because I didn't have to commute every day to the office, I ended up renting a place in Catonsville in the western suburbs of Baltimore, right by where the serial killing happened of Adnan. Adnan, the assassin, as I call him, that motherfucker guilty. Guarantee you. And, I loved being there. And, I was involved with a woman in D.C. and then ended up not pursuing things for her and marrying a woman from New York who had lived around the country because her parents were in the in the Fukra, Jamaat Fukra, which was a kind of a militant black Sufi Muslim organization that, has a lot of positives too. Very good character, very good adab, as we say in Arabic. She has 2 children. Almost as soon as we get married, I get fired from my job at Mass with Matthew Bray because of some internal disputes within the organization having nothing to do with me. Bam, I end up back in St. Louis again as a taxi driver. And I stayed back in St. Louis. And this time, I guess it's because I was a family man now and having the kids with me, I fell back in love with St. Louis. I fell back in love with everything I loved growing up. I'd always been a Cardinals fan. I'd always been a St. Louis sports fan. I'd always been a St. Louis history buff, but just falling in love with the city again of not wanting to be anywhere else. That's what happened. And so when me and her split, Fatima, when we split, she told me, she said, I thought as soon as we split that, and we had a daughter, she said, I thought as soon as we split that you would move back to the East Coast. And Fatima had moved to Dallas because her mother had moved to Dallas. There were other options. Her grandfather had been a professor at Morehouse College, Dr. Cyril Moore, but she ends up going to Dallas and with my daughter. But I stayed in St. Louis, working in the Leclerc cab. And I had got so popular as a national Muslim writer that I ended up just kind of falling back because, shit got corny to me, stale to me. And so when the Lyft and the Uber issue came up, I began to focus on St. Louis and become a St. Louis writer. And focus on St. Louis issues. And kind of the Muslim issues took a backseat. And plus, I wasn't as religious or as observant as I had been in previous eras. Because, I'd seen a lot of, corruption and bullshit. And just, it's a whole nother topic for a different audience. So, I stay in St. Louis, working at Leclerc. And I say everything is, kun fayakun, being it is. Everything is a plan, a color of Allah. And I was meant to be in St. Louis because Darren Wilson murdered Mike Brown, and I was in place to cover that story. To cover that story for a local audience, to cover it for an international audience, to be featured in international media outlets and even in books and documentaries, etc., covering that. I really believe that's why I stayed in St. Louis. I didn't even know it. And then eventually, because of my activism, I get fired from the Clee Cab. And basically, that was 3 years ago, and it's been a pretty chaotic 3 years. There's different jobs, different places to stay, etc. It's been a lot of financial chaos in my life. It's been a lot of struggle. But eventually, last year, I said, man, I don't want to be nowhere else but St. Louis. Like, I'm in love with St. Louis, which is something I never thought I'd be. If you told me in my 20s I'd be in love with St. Louis, I think you're crazy. But more than I'm in love with St. Louis is I love my daughter. With my oldest daughter, who's in St. Louis, I never got to spend a lot of time with her. And I said, well, with my younger daughter, that's not going to happen. So I may not like Dallas-Fort Worth. I may not like suburban Dallas, but that's where she's at, so that's where I'm going to be. So last September, I made the decision to come down here to live. And am I homesick constantly? Yes. Would I rather be in St. Louis? Yes. Do I like Texas? No, not really, but I'm learning to see little things here and there that I like and little neighborhoods here and there that I like. But at the end of the day, it's not about what I like. It's about responsibility. It's about duty. And it's about love. It's about all those things. And so I'm where I need to be. And I'm happy to be here now. And you got to make that sacrifice. And it is what it is. But this is just my story of being out of St. Louis. And St. Louis Speaks podcast, we're going to talk to other St. Louis transplants and people in the St. Louis diaspora Even down here, you have St. Louis style pizza restaurants. You have St. Louis style Chinese. You see the Cardinals hat everywhere. The St. Louis influence is live here in Dallas. Peace.